The following presentation is brought to you by the Executive Office of the Mayor of the District of Columbia in commemoration of D.C. Emancipation Day 2021.
My country.
This is a fight for the people of the District of Columbia.
Every day there's some kind of effect because we're not a state.
Washington DC se merece representación en el Congreso.
Then in this era of racial reckoning, this is our moment.
It is important for the people in the District of Columbia to have full status as a part of this country.
DC statehood now.
For the first time in history, D.C. statehood bills will likely come up for votes this year in both houses during the 117th Congress. Now, if past debates about D.C. statehood are any guide, the arguments about these bills will be contentious and will largely focus on questions of history. Why should D.C. become a state? Can we admit new states into the Union? Or is statehood for D.C. even constitutional?
All good questions, I suppose. On our journey to answering these and other questions that you might have, we will learn that the history of the district governance is long and complicated. To inform our discussion, we have engaged historians and scholars, congressional representatives, city officials, past and present, business leaders and community advocates to trace the progress and the setbacks of D.C. residents' self-governance from 1790 to the present day. Now, we hope this presentation will help you better appreciate Washington, D.C.'s long quest toward equality.
I'm Andrea Roan.
And I'm Bruce Johnson.
Thank you for joining us for this special Becoming Douglas Commonwealth, from D.C. disenfranchisement to full democracy.
I'm Robert J. Conte III. I grew up here in this city. I'm a native Washingtonian. Several generations of my family have lived here. I raised my children here, right here in this city. I'm a graduate of Spingarn Senior High School, as well as a graduate of George Washington University. Growing up as a kid, I never really understood the need for or understood why we never had representation here in our city. But now as chief of police, being out in community, day in and day out, seeing the impacts on community members, I think it's time to right that injustice. It's really time to get to the root of the issue and why we are where we are.
We begin back when it all started. The country was young and new. About 6 years had passed since we fought and won the Revolutionary War. Now our founders were busy charting a course for the country. But there was this important early question.
So there was a big debate about where to place the seat of government. Where do we put the capital? Many of the founders, particularly George Washington, envisioned that the city that would land the capital would gain economic benefits there. There would be prestige, and it would become a cultural and commercial center.
In 1789, Congress actually votes to place the seat of government in Pennsylvania. This, of course, distresses many Southern representatives, including James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, as well as President Washington, who want to have a Southern capital, not only for those reasons about prestige and economic benefits and so forth, but also because they are concerned about preserving the institution on which the Southern economy rests, and that is slavery.
I just don't think people fully understand that this was chosen as the capital as a signal to slavery, as a signal to slavery. So this brand new nation was in search of a capital. There were over 30 available venues, because as you know, George Washington had the oath of office administered in New York. Mm-hmm. The biggest city in America then was Philadelphia, which was the home of the Continental Congress. All of these venues were natural choices to be the capital, but in the room where it happened, you know, the song from the musical Hamilton, Jefferson and Madison cut the deal that this capital would be along the banks of the Potomac because it would be a gesture to the institution of slavery.
The room where it happened is all about that compromise. It brought the capital to this
place, which was considered the South. The debts that the northern states had from the Revolutionary War were taken on by the federal government.
Those founders who lobbied hardest for locating the capital in between Maryland and Virginia, their primary focus is to protect the institution of slavery. And they succeed by locating the capital on the Potomac River between two of the largest slaveholding states in the Union.
The Southern-based founders knew enslaved labor would help establish a robust economy in the newly fermented seat of government. After all, slavery was big business in those times. They also knew that enslaved labor would be vitally needed to build the infrastructure of this city, and especially to erect the great monuments and landmarks that would house and distinguish the seat of government.
In 1791, it was placed right here, and it was carved out from portions of Maryland, portions of Virginia. We had a map that was made in 1791 by Peter L'Enfant. Peter L'Enfant designed the city, and his map still in part governs how the city operates today.
The founders wanted a capital that was outside of the power of any state. They wanted a capital that they controlled, that Congress controlled. And they called that idea the idea of exclusive legislation. The idea comes from what's called the Philadelphia Mutiny of 1783. And it was a moment where decommissioned War for Independence soldiers headed to Philadelphia because they wanted back pay that they were owed by the Confederation Congress.
The disgruntled soldiers waged a mutiny, which alarmed members of Congress, especially leaders like Alexander Hamilton.
Congress realized at that moment that it didn't have control over the police powers in the place where it was meeting. So many of the people that were in the Confederation Congress essentially say, we want to make sure we have exclusive legislation. And 4 years later, they write that into the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17.
This goes to the notion that began with the framers, what to do with the capital. It's not a state. Should they have the same rights everyone else? So the compromise was to leave it essentially to the Congress to figure out. The framers never quite figured out where the capital should be, but believe me and mark me, there is nothing in the record that showed that the framers meant the people who lived in their own nation's capital wouldn't have the same rights everyone else. Not after fighting the Revolutionary War on the principle of rights for everybody who lived in this country.
In 1801, Congress created the Organic Act for the district, formally organizing the three already incorporated towns of Washington City, Georgetown, and Alexandria, along with the surrounding counties. But the Organic Act was a rushed piece of legislation, passed during our nation's first power shift in Congress, from the Federalists to the Republicans. Because of their partisan politics, the act defines the boundaries of Washington, but stops short of providing full representation for residents of the nation's capital.
After the Organic Act is passed, D.C. does get a local government. In 1802, Congress gives Washington City, what it was called at the time, a charter. And in that charter, we get a council and a presidentially appointed mayor. Later on in the antebellum period, in the early 1800s, we get an elected mayor. So by the time that we get to the Civil War, we have approximately 60 years of local governance only in the District of Columbia. So we have a council and a mayor who essentially run things here in Washington City. We still don't have any representation in Congress, and of course, we can't vote for president.
We begin to see a pattern here. Congress gives the city power. Congress gives the city less power. Congress gives the city more power. Congress takes it away entirely. This has been the story of Washington, D.C. since the beginning.
The story of the district, from its inception, is also defined by protests against the lack of congressional representation. Remember, before Maryland and Virginia ceded its land to form the seat of government, residents of the 10-square-mile grid had enjoyed full representation through their senators and representatives. Now they had no representation. District residents who resided on the southern side of the Potomac River decided to take matters into their own hands.
So residents on the Virginia side of the district felt like they were stagnating compared to Washington City and the parts on the Maryland side of the Potomac River. So they basically said, we want to be American citizens again. And the way to do that is by petitioning to be retroceded or given back to the state of Virginia.
Adding to their frustration was a looming issue that threatened the livelihood of district residents on the southern side of the Potomac.
The retrocession movement really gained steam in the early 1830s, 1840s because of the growth of the abolitionist movement. In the mid-1830s, abolitionists started flooding Congress with all of these petitions calling for the end of slavery and the slave trade in D.C. Over on the Virginia side of the district, you had many slave trading operations, including the nation's largest, Franklin and Armfield, located right on Duke Street.
These slave traders and all the industries around it that benefited from slavery and the slave trade, they were worried that Congress would listen to these abolitionists, would end slavery and the slave trade in D.C., and cut the knees out of their industry. Remember, Alexandria was the #1 slave trading city in the country in the 1830s. This is a big business. Franklin and Armfield is one of the largest corporations in the entire country in any industry. And so to protect what they called their property, white Alexandrians started to petition for retrocession. And in 1846, Congress agrees, and that land is then retroceded and becomes part of Virginia.
The growing abolitionist movement makes Washington a primary target for its anti-slavery campaign. Abolitionists pressure Congress because, unlike other states, Congress had the power to end slavery in the district without state government interference. At the same time, abolitionists recognized that having slavery in the citadel of our democracy was a moral stain on our nation.
It was a national disgrace, in fact, in the capital of a nation that prided itself on being the land of the free and the home of the brave. There were auctions of enslaved people that took place from Georgetown to Southwest. It was a regular feature of the everyday economic ebb and flow of the city. And so as a result of a blizzard of petitions and memorials, local action, and we cannot forget the consistent attempts by enslaved and free African Americans for their own freedom, that of their families, and an end to enslavement. All of these forces combined to finally end slavery on April 16th, 1862.
The enslaved people of Washington, D.C. became the first to be emancipated in the nation. This was a federal experiment. Abraham Lincoln was trying to figure out how to keep the loyalty of the slave-owning states that were in the Union.
So Lincoln used the Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862 to offer payment to owners of enslaved people for the loss of their human property.
When we look at, in context, D.C. emancipation led to the Emancipation Proclamation. Seeing the success of D.C. emancipation, Lincoln decided to be even bolder.
The Congress moves relatively quickly in 1862 towards freedom for the roughly 3,000 African Americans who are still enslaved in the District of Columbia. And once they do that, you get a population of African Americans in the city that's about 15,000 people. And as African Americans who are enslaved in Maryland and Virginia see this, they realize that if they run to the District of Columbia, they can in fact become free. And so about 30 to 40,000 people do. So that swells the Black population well into the low 40,000 range.
If I had to encapsulate in one word why Black people were drawn to the nation's capital beginning at the time of the Civil War and going into the early years of the 20th century, it would be that it represented, the city itself represented opportunity. the freedom to vote, the freedom to control your own destiny politically.
Fast forward just a couple years. In the mid-1860s, the district is one of the first places in the entire country to get African American suffrage. African Americans get the vote in local elections. So all of a sudden, in 1867, you have in the city biracial democracy, a place in this country where African American men and white men and men of any racial background are able to vote in local elections.
Reconstruction is a time that's often misunderstood in American history, but it was this remarkable time of racial and political progress that happened in a very short period of time. Once radical Republicans in Congress are able to pass over President Johnson's veto, they pass the Negro Suffrage Act, and Black voters start voting, the results are immediate. Right? The racist mayor of Georgetown, Henry Addison, is ousted in February 1867, a month after the bill takes effect. Black voters install a Republican majority in Washington City in June 1867. The next year, they vote in a white abolitionist as mayor.
The city government, which was elected, was heavily dominated by members of the Republican Party, which, remember then, was the party of Abraham Lincoln, and it was the party that Black people joined. Washington had been dominated before that by members of the Democratic Party who were white, and they were conservative, and they were racists.
In 1869, you have Black men representing each ward in the city on the Board of Aldermen. It's a remarkable change, and it's not just in politics. There are advances in Black education, the establishment of Black public schools, the establishment of Howard University, the growth of Black home and land ownership, and the establishment of dairy farms on the east side of the river.
By the late 1860s, Washington, D.C. was becoming a prototype of an integrated America where Black people enjoyed political and civic, though not social, equality. It was a haven for Black advancement, attracting some of the nation's top Black intellectuals and political figures, including famed orator Frederick Douglass. The radical Republicans led this charge to, in the words of then Senator Charles Sumner, Democrat from Massachusetts, make Washington an example for all the land. They wielded their exclusive authority over the city to field test a range of Reconstruction legislation, from freedmen's relief to Black men's suffrage, with the aim of implementing these programs across the vehemently resisting South. Well, Southern congressional leaders naturally took issue with this, and over the next few years, their resistance, combined with the actions of conservative white residents of D.C., would lead to the loss of voting power and representation in the district for nearly the next century. The first step came in February 1871. That's when Congress established a territorial government that limited electoral power.
D.C. was given a democratic, small d, territorial government with a governor appointed by the president, an upper legislative council, and a board of public work. It was also given a lower house of delegates voted on by male D.C. voters, who were the only people who could vote at that time, and a non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives.
Around this time, there's a real movement that's building behind the scenes, and it comes to the forefront with the rise of a successful businessman named Alexander Shepard. He's a son of a slaveholder, born in Washington. He's a unionist during the Civil War, but he's not anti-slavery.
What Alexander Shepard is a businessman and an opportunist. He maneuvers to have Congress create a new board of public works, purposed to restore the district following the ravages of the Civil War. Then Boss Shepard maneuvers to have himself appointed as head of this board so he can take full advantage of the federal government's resources.
Get this, where Congress had allocated Boss Shepard a budget of $6 million, he spent over $20 million. That's over $400 million in today's economy. By 1874, congressional investigators are hot on his trail. They find evidence of corruption, cost overruns, kickbacks, shoddy work, all kinds of problems. Congress then uses this investigation as an excuse to get rid of all form of elected government in the district. Now, mind you, of the 22 elected legislators of the territorial government, only a few of them were Black. Still, Black voters shouldered a lot of blame as if they had caused the problem.
When people looked at the profligate spending of Alexander Shepard and the Board of Public Works, they actually blamed Black voters for allowing Shepard free rein, basically. And so Congress steps in and says, look, in the interest of property and order and good government, we need to take the franchise, take the ballot away from everyone in the district and move towards an unelected city administration where there will be 3 presidential appointees. That's established in 1874 on a temporary basis and is made permanent in 1878. And for the next century, essentially, DC voters, Black and white, cast no ballot of serious consequences until the late 1960s.
The taking away of democracy here in the District of Columbia in 1874 is based on a racist lie. Simple as that. Those people who were very well-to-do white elites in the city who really wanted more money from Congress, wanted a congressional payment that would allow them to keep funding public improvements, people like Alexander Shepard. They essentially traded the vote for money from Congress. And to justify it all, they said, well, the Black folks simply aren't ready for democratic government. It was a racist lie where they traded money for their democratic birthright.
This idea has long-lasting consequences because throughout the late 19th and early 20th into the mid-20th centuries, any time that there's an organic movement to win back the right to vote, opponents will bring Reconstruction back up and they will say, yeah, we tried that and it was a disaster.
Disenfranchisement. It hurt both Black and white voters, but it had a particularly devastating impact on Black Washingtonians because it crippled their ability to defend and advance their interests. Without the ballot, Black leaders struggled to hold city officials accountable or secure access to public jobs. Black laborers complained that they were shut out from city contracts, which were an important source of jobs in a city without any major industry. Appointments to city positions vanished. The commissioners also turned a blind eye to Black poverty, which persisted at distressingly high rates. The commissioners who ran the city, all white men until 1961, when President Kennedy appointed John Duncan, routinely ignored Black concerns.
I think it's more for the convenience of Congress and to have some 3 commissioners who would take on the responsibility of day-to-day managing the district. We were delighted when there was an African-American named John Duncan, and we lived not too far from John Duncan. He was a lovely man, but he didn't have a whole lot of power. I mean, he was lucky if he could give you a tag. Seriously.
Once you get the 3-commissioner system of government, you have pretty good representation for the white elites in the business community in the city because they can sit down over cigars and brandy with the congressional leaders on the district committees, any appointees that they need to in the administration, and hammer out rules without much democratic interference from the larger population.
And with the establishment of permanent territorial governance, there was one important trade-off. In assuming full control of the district, Congress pledged in the Organic Act of 1878 to cover 50% of the city's annual budget.
The basic deal of disenfranchisement was this. In exchange for giving up the right to suffrage, D.C. residents would get federal support. Essentially, the federal government would pay 50% of the city's budget, and this was a recognition that being the capital of the country has its costs. There's the upkeep of federal buildings, there are many costs associated with housing the federal government, and there's a loss of revenue, because not only is the federal government land not taxed, but there are restrictions on the taxes that can be levied on people who work in the city but don't live here.
The half and half plan, also known as the 50-50 plan, works for the first few decades after disenfranchisement, but by the early decades of the 1900s, the federal government starts to back away from its commitment. By the 1920s, the 1930s, the federal government is actually paying less than 20% of the city's budget. So the city begins to struggle to provide the basic level of services for district residents. This is in part why a new suffrage movement emerges between 1900 and 1930, demanding the right to vote.
By the end of World War II, life in Washington was largely segregated, protected by the laws and customs of a city that remained officially dedicated to preserving racial separation. Despite decades of protests, D.C. remained a southern city whose white leaders defended racial restrictive covenants, upheld a dual school system, and supported Jim Crow practices. Throughout this period, advocates for full democracy in the district continued to agitate for representation and equal rights. Interestingly enough, by the late 1940s, home rule was gaining bipartisan support, including the support of Presidents Harry S. Truman, a Democrat, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Republican.
Coming out of World War II, the United States is trying to make sure that it has a very positive image in the world, because it's increasingly obvious at this point that the United States is going to be the leader of the Western Bloc, and it's trying to convince the rest of the world that American democracy is sound. And then you have the nation's capital, which not only doesn't have sort of a functional local government, nobody votes at all. And so both political parties go on record, primarily driven by their liberal and moderate members, that they want to return the vote to Washington, D.C. The Democratic Party does it as early as 1940 in its party platform. The Republican Party follows suit in 1948. Very quickly, both parties begin to endorse home rule. And by the early 1960s, both parties are endorsing congressional representation for the district in Congress.
While both party platforms may have endorsed home rule, the segregationist and conservative members of Congress, many of whom chaired key committees, blocked all legislation from ever making it to the floor. Over the next 2 decades, supporters of D.C. suffrage would have to settle for small, measured advances.
So the first major piece of legislation to go through to Congress is a bill endorsed by President Eisenhower, backed forcefully by Republican chairs of several committees, saying that D.C. residents can vote in primary elections, and that's passed in 1955. Then you get a bill saying that D.C. residents can vote for president, which of course becomes the 23rd Amendment in 1960. And we move forward like that in fits and starts through the 50s and 60s.
In 1878, Congress totally took over Washington, D.C. again and ran the city with 3 commissioners that the president appointed. And that situation lasted for all of these years of our history, all the way up until 1967, when President Lyndon Johnson, after being lobbied, after being sensitive to the civil rights movement, decided to change it.
President Johnson appointed a 9-member city council, a deputy mayor, and the Honorable Walter Washington as mayor. 6 years later, Congress finally passed the Home Rule Act of 1973, giving the residents of the district the right to elect their own government and determine their own governing laws.
It was the people who had come out of the civil rights movement who took the leadership, and even one of our own, Walter Fauntroy, SCLC. Mac Mathias played a big role.
Maryland.
Charlie Diggs played a big role. There was an enormous sense of hope and electricity in this town when we got home rule.
But not everyone was enthusiastic about home rule.
Julius Hobson, one of the founders of the statehood party, derisively described the Home Rule Act as a home fool. It did not give the people of the District of Columbia complete control. The budget still has to be approved by Congress. The Congress can overturn things. It did not give the District of Columbia power over the courts.
Home rule was an important victory, but it was incomplete. Congress still maintains exclusive legislation over all city affairs, which has presented tremendous challenges for the district's elected officials.
Our country is built on the bedrock that decisions are best made closest to the people. So therefore, local leaders who've been elected by their people should be making decisions about policies that affect them. And What not being a state means is that the Congress can always interfere with our laws. The people of Washington elect a city council and a mayor. That city council passes laws. I sign them into law, and that should be it. Instead, there is a check on those laws by the federal government.
It's about sovereignty. I mean, you make a decision, and you have somebody from West Jabip comes along and tells you they can reverse your decision with your tax dollars and after you've reflected on it. And I know Tony and Vince can speak to that with even greater authority.
The amount of time we spend up in Congress fending off intrusions of Congress on everything from reproductive rights to needle exchange to you name it, right? Public safety issues.
Gun control, all of it. No, he's right. You spend hours up there. I mean, you constantly have to go there and beg them. You know, the time that you should be spending with the people of the District of Columbia.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just the question of representation in Congress. It's also the fact that Congress ultimately can control local legislation for people in Washington and can micromanage the affairs of people in D.C. And that's been a nightmare for people in D.C. on everything from criminal justice issues to publicly funded reproductive health care for women and abortion rights. It's been a nightmare from the standpoint of adoption of children by gay couples and on and on. D.C. is often treated as a kind of plaything by right-wing forces in Congress that could never get their legislation passed for everybody in America and oppress people's rights across the country, but they can do it to D.C., which doesn't have voting representation.
Now that we know more about the history of disenfranchisement, the question we must ask is how would statehood improve the lives of Washington residents? Let's explore this question, looking at 8 critical areas, beginning with our court system.
Right now, the district's court system is controlled by the federal government. The President of the United States appoints all of our judges, even the ones that sit in our family court. No other state or local jurisdiction, not even the territories, have that level of federal interference in their legal system. And on top of that, our top prosecutor is the federally appointed United States attorney, someone who is not directly accountable to the people of Washington, D.C. Our unequal representation in the justice system is just one more way in which the people of the district do not have the same rights as other citizens of the United States.
Health and wellness.
The first thing that comes to mind is the congressional rider from years ago on needle exchange. What we saw was a state-of-the-art approach toward reducing the spread of HIV/AIDS and other diseases associated with needles. So we adopted needle exchange law, and Congress stopped us, prevented it. And as the result of that, was statistically shown that the district led the country in incidence of HIV/AIDS. Led the country, exactly the opposite of what we needed for public health. But we didn't have control. We didn't have statehood.
The pandemic has been a terrible health crisis. Unfortunately, we in the District of Columbia did not receive our fair share of the resources necessary to protect our citizens.
Recently, of course, during the federal government's transfer of resources to state, D.C. was overlooked. That was corrected. What's impressive about how Mayor Bowser and her residents handled it is, though, there was never any misstep, even when the funding was short.
Transportation and infrastructure.
We've got Maryland as a state, we've got Virginia as a state, we've got Washington, D.C. as a city. Yet people are commuting, they're living in Maryland, they're living in Virginia, and they're coming into the city. How are we going to support that public transportation on the city's budget of $14 billion compared to these gigantic state budgets that Maryland and Virginia have, and the aid that they can get from the federal government.
It is extremely important that when you look at the transportation budget for this country and how it's allocated, the district and their citizens need to be seated at the table, and we need to have support. The infrastructure is aging, and we need to make sure that we have the dollars necessary to repair, to fix, to renovate, and build new bridges and roads.
Education.
We make decisions now based on what we think is good for the children and their families of the District of Columbia. I think we'd be in a far better position with statehood, especially around education outcomes.
We are molding children to be the messages that we take into the future. And as we do that, the federal government seems to have more input into our local education than they do in any other state. For example, the District of Columbia was mandated to create charter schools. It did not depend on whether or not the citizens felt that they were the best for the district. They very well may be, but it ought to be a local decision.
Housing and development.
The availability of affordable housing is a major crisis in our city. If we were a state, we would receive more money from HUD, which would allow us to provide the housing, the affordable housing, the safe housing that many people who have lived in our city for a long period of time deserve.
The district government now pays for the security at our public housing because the federal government doesn't. And we pay for a lot of the vouchers for our residents because the federal government has cut back in its financial support. And our public housing needs several $1 billion of repairs because the federal government has inadequately funded public housing. Its program has inadequately funded it, so we have to step up. And it speaks to our strength as a government that ought to have full statehood.
Business and enterprise.
I think business fares better because the economy is now growing better, both regionally and locally in the district. The tax system is not anti-competitive to the district. People say, well, the district taxes are too high. If we had a level playing field, a level economic field, you wouldn't have these distortions.
So you have to think, if I'm a business and I'm thinking of where to relocate, I can go to Maryland, I can go to Virginia, or I can go to the district. I'm going to be less likely to locate in a place where I know that there's no congressperson that can vote or 2 senators that can advocate for my interests here. So businesses would naturally choose to go to the suburbs, and that's just an unfair advantage that we need to overcome.
Maryland has its FDA and NIH. Virginia has its high-tech industry, but now Boeing and the defense industry. I think our ability to attract headquarters companies to this region will be dramatically enhanced.
Human rights and equality.
We've seen thousands of young people march the streets of Washington, D.C., fighting for things like affordable housing and fighting for equity, equality, and justice. Those are D.C. values.
And we see that many of our neighbors are full of different Latino communities, restaurants, many men and women that work in the district. I do believe that precisely statehood will mean better education for those Latinos, better rights, to be treated like every other equal American.
DC residents have embraced our DC values, and that is really an embrace of the diversity of Washington. We see diversity as our strength. So no matter where you're from, who you love, what language you speak, DC residents stand shoulder to shoulder with each other. And statehood only strengthens that.
Public safety.
The one glaring opening in a public safety vein is that, we want to be able to control the National Guard just like every other governor does. We want to be able to control local streets just like every other governor.
This need to control our National Guard and to safeguard our streets became a harsh reality earlier this year during the tragic events of the Capitol insurrection.
On January 6, 2021, the Metropolitan Police Department deployed over 1,000 officers to defend our nation's capital. In essence, defend the democracy of this country. Yet our city does not have representation does not have a vote in Congress. I just think that there's something unfair about that.
Statehood will not solve all of the challenges we face as Washingtonians, but it will certainly level the playing field. Beginning in January of 2019, statehood for D.C. has taken a positive turn in the chambers of Congress. Now, with the support of the Biden administration, D.C. statehood is growing great momentum.
I've introduced legislation along with Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's been an extraordinary fighter for the District of Columbia and for the objective of statehood. And I'm confident that we'll pass it through the House as we did last year and send it to the Senate. And I pray that the Senate will see the wisdom of voting to make the 700,000 residents of the District of Columbia full participating citizens.
But as the recent congressional hearing on March 22nd revealed, the process faces fierce opposition. Here are some of the arguments being raised against D.C. statehood. Statehood for D.C. is unconstitutional.
Congress has the power to admit new states under Article 4 of the Constitution. There have been constitutional objections leveled against every statehood admission. The one that's being leveled against Washington, D.C. is that somehow the federal district is frozen and the boundaries can't change, because that is the statehood proposal, to shrink the federal district to include the White House, the Capitol, the mall, the federal buildings, and then to cede the residential lands to the new state, which would be admitted under congressional powers. But the power of Congress to modify the boundaries of the federal district has already been well established. Alexandria, Arlington, and Fairfax County used to be part of the District of Columbia and were retroceded in 1847 to Virginia. And there was no constitutional problem with it, and there should be no constitutional problem with changing the boundaries today in order to admit the new state.
Statehood requires a constitutional amendment.
Statehood does not require a constitutional amendment. Every new state since the original 13 colonies was admitted simply by an act of Congress. And the same would be true of the District of Columbia.
New states have usually been added in pairs.
The argument that statehood is usually granted in pairs is misleading at best and downright dishonest in some ways. Now, while Alaska and Hawaii both gained statehood together in 1959, there is no real precedent that two states need to join at once. In fact, the people making this argument completely skip over what happened in 1889 and 1890, when 6 states were admitted at once, the largest expansion of states since the original 13. The rush to admit these states came after one party grew concerned that they were losing favor with the American people, so they added 12 new senators and 18 new electors to the Electoral College from an area of the country that favored their policy and political positions.
D.C. statehood will weight Congress in favor of the Democratic Party.
Oh my gosh. So there is an argument, of course, made by mostly Republican members of Congress who say, oh, this is just a power grab, that the Democrats are trying to make D.C. a state so that they will have more representation in Congress. Well, hey, here's an idea for the Republican Party. Try to get those votes. Try to get those votes. Try to get elected in D.C. But more foundational even to this, my concern with this argument is that there are right now in this moment, there are 50 Republican senators and there are 50 Democratic senators elected to the Congress right now. The 50 Democratic senators represent 41 million more Americans than the 50 Republican senators represent. And that's because the Senate is the original gerrymander written into the Constitution, and written into the Constitution explicitly to protect slavery, and then used after the Civil War to protect Jim Crow and to set it up.
What do we do with the 23rd Amendment?
Well, part of the proposal is to repeal the 23rd Amendment, which gives the current district 3 electoral votes. And there would be great incentive for the remaining states to do that, because if anybody could exercise those 3 electoral votes after the Douglas Commonwealth is a state, it would be a very small number of people. It's a question mark whether anybody could actually exercise those votes, because the only people who would likely live in the remaining district would be the president and his family, who by definition are residents of another state.
D.C. should be retroceded back to Maryland.
And what do we become? A county of the state of Maryland then? I think it's such an insult to suggest that we should retrocede, to Maryland. I think we have made the case amply for the right to be able to be a state.
That's an argument against 700,000 people who don't want to be absorbed by somebody else. They are the District of Columbia. They want to be their entity, and very frankly, we granted them home rule. Retrocession is not an option.
D.C. is not ready for statehood.
The city is being well run. We have had moments in our city's past, as have a lot of other main cities, where there is a bad example or a bad moment in time where there's corruption or perhaps different kind of leadership and decisions that are being made. But that's not endemic to Washington, D.C.
The district's economy is as strong as it's ever been, and is as strong as any place in the country right now. We also have more reserves per capita than any other municipality or state in the country.
We've balanced 24 years of budgets. Our city has a good economy. We are well financed.
What's very important to know is that the district already is a donor to the federal government. And what I mean by that is that we pay more in federal taxes than we get back in federal programs. And we've done that by building a very diverse economy. DC pays for all of our programs from state and local taxes that we collect from our residents. We're treated like a state in most federal allocations, so we don't get any more than any state in the union gets in terms of housing assistance or in terms of Medicaid or support of federal programs involving education.
D.C. does not have much of a working class.
An opponent of D.C. statehood said that D.C. didn't deserve statehood because it was, the same size as the state of Wyoming. But he said that the people of Wyoming were a population that were more well-rounded and more working class.
I don't think statehood relies on having certain numbers of people in different classes. But the notion that we don't have a working class in D.C. Is also completely wrong. Today, most working class people all over the country work in the service industry, not in those traditional blue-collar jobs. They are in retail and leisure and hospitality and administrative support and the lower end of healthcare and elder care, personal services. They all work very hard, often for very low pay. But today in America, working class is much more of a service industry phenomenon rather than the old industries like manufacturing.
D.C. does not have agriculture, mining, and manufacturing.
Anyone who goes around the District of Columbia will see lots of other kinds of establishments of exactly the kind you have in the state. So that argument to make us somehow singular as a jurisdiction from other places, simply because, as some Republicans say, we don't have cows and we don't have steel mills, does not understand how varied the economies of our states really are.
In the first century of America's economy, agriculture was dominant. And yeah, maybe we didn't have a lot of farms. In the Industrial Revolution, when heavy manufacturing was the dominant part of our American economy, maybe we didn't have a lot of factories. But right now, in the 21st century tech economy, we are a leader in innovation.
The fastest growing sector is the private sector in Washington, D.C. The federal government isn't growing jobs. And we have focused and we will in our new state, focus on how we build jobs of the future, jobs in technology, jobs in hospitality, jobs in higher education, and jobs in medicine and health. These are all growing sectors in Washington, D.C.
To be clear, the Constitution does not define statehood by the characteristics of a territory, but solely by the will of a territory's residents to become loyal citizens. As the following voices affirm, this is why statehood for D.C. should matter to all Americans.
I think when people find that they live in a country where the people who live in their own capital don't have equal rights, that brings shame and, beyond that, a determination to do something about it.
There is a growing movement for DC statehood across the country, not professional politicos, but normal everyday people across the country who are focused on what we can do to save democracy.
Every moment that DC isn't a state is every moment that we're losing progress on the important issues that we care about and that we're fighting for as young people.
Well, as a registered Republican, I've always felt that government that's closest to the people is the most effective, subject, of course, to constitutional protections and equal protection. But I think it's important to have a government that's available and accessible to the people of the district and that has its voice in Congress as well as a legislature here.
Full statehood for the District of Columbia means that every American can now stand proudly and say, we're a country that not only talks democracy, but we practice it.
At a moment when voting rights are under attack across our nation, the step to recognize the voting rights of our citizens in Washington, D.C. would be transformative.
In order to make the promise of democracy real for us all, Washington, D.C. must become the 51st state.
As we draw this special to a close, we invite you to dream with us about what the future state of Washington will be.
And while the name Douglas Commonwealth is only a suggested name at this stage, it is a name that represents great promise, and it connects our present course with over 220 years of D.C. history in the fight for full democracy.
Douglas Commonwealth, how better to characterize this city than through Frederick Douglass?
We want to be telling every Washingtonian and every person in America and around the world that in Washington, we will be here in the 21st century fighting for the rights and the well-being of every single citizen.
Statehood will free us. That's why we have the slogan, Free DC.
Our mayor that operates as a governor, she will have her real title. She will be Governor Bowser. Our council will be a unicameral legislature, and it will be a House of Representatives.
This is a moment for us. There could be no greater symbol, no greater act to protect and advance the right to representation in our nation than to grant representation to the people in our nation's capital.
The way you know we're different is look at what that DC means. Not District of Columbia. We're Washington, Douglas, Commonwealth.
We will be where we should be, equal, and I think when you compare to the other states, a shining star.
We will be fully part of the union. We'll have 2 senators, we'll have representation. We will never be able to have a president try to take over our police department. We will never be silent in discussions about the confirmations of Supreme Court justices. We won't have to look at our children and say, you have to move if you aspire to be a senator or a governor. Because those aspirations that children in the 50 states across our nation have, our children can have right here at home.
My parents grew up in this city before we had home rule. I grew up in this city under the era of home rule. Maybe my kids can grow up in an era where DC has statehood. where our voices, the voices of community, the voices of all the young people in the communities that we serve day in and day out, where those voices are heard in Congress, where those voices are heard across our country, because we matter.
I deserve representation.
Io mi merito di essere rappresentato.
I deserve representation.
And I deserve representation.
I deserve representation.
Eu mereço representação.
I deserve representation.
Yo quiero ser representado.
I deserve representation.
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 أنا دمت علي.
I deserve representation.
We are becoming Douglas Commonwealth.
Voting rights we're fighting for. 5, 6, 7, 8. We cannot afford to wait.
I think that DC should have statehood so we can have equal representation in Congress. I deserve representation.
I think DC absolutely deserves statehood. We deserve the same representation as everybody else in this country.
Yeah, I've been a resident of DC since 1969 for 60 years. Grew up in Adams Morgan, and it's time for us to have statehood. It's time for we pay taxes like everybody else.
There's a huge amount of people here and there and having their voices heard. It's absolutely stupid. I don't understand it at all.
I'm a resident of Ward 7 and I demand representation.
Apoyamos que DC se convierta en un estado, puesto que mucha gente vive en la ciudad mucho más que edificios del gobierno. Tiene una población mayor que otros estados en el país.
I've been here for 30 years and I love it here. A lot of more good things coming our way if they was to turn this into a state.
We are 700,000 strong. We need a right to make our voices heard in the government.
We deserve representation.
I think we need statehood because we have taxation without representation.
I'm in support of DC statehood. We're getting taxed, but we're not getting represented the same way. So,
DC is a dynamic, exciting, wonderful place to live. I've lived here for 34 years. They don't need external forces to tell them how to live.